To God be the glory, great things he has done. So loved him the world that he gave us his son, who yielded his life and atonement for sin, and opened the life gate that all may go in.
Thanks for tuning in to No Trash, Just Truth, a podcast of Proverbs 910 Ministries.
With your hosts, Chris Paxson and Rose Spiller. Be sure to check out our other podcast, 5 a.m. Theology, available on all platforms.
And give him the glory, great things he has done.
Welcome back. We really hope that you're enjoying this series on the Reformation. Today, we're going to dive into the English Reformation. As you probably already know, during the Middle Ages, the English suffered many of the same things that the other countries that we've already mentioned were suffering. They suffered the Black Death. They were suffering from the 100-year French and English War, which raged from 1337 to 1453. And it was estimated from that 2.3 to 3.3 million people died. So they were all suffering at this point. And it should come as no surprise that some of the English suffered at the hands of the Inquisition. John Wycliffe was English. He was born in Yorkshire, England in 1328, and his influence was widespread, but it also had effects in his homeland.
And Chris, we've mentioned some of his followers in other episodes, like the Waldensians and stuff. And there was a particular group. They were called the Lollards. I think we alluded to them, but we didn't go into detail. Lollards is the pejorative form of a Dutch word, lolliert, which means mumbler. Now, they didn't get that name because they mumbled their words. It was a term that was used for someone who piously held to heretical beliefs. So it was the Roman Church that called them Lollards because they said they were heretical. So one of those associated with Wycliffe and the Lollards was a priest named John Ball. John Ball was born in 1338, shortly after England and France's 100-Year War got underway. He grew up and became a priest in the Roman Church, yet he didn't have a parish. In God's providence, that let Ball end up being a traveling preacher.
John Ball delivered radical sermons that earned him the nickname the Mad Priest of Kent. Ball preached the doctrines of Wycliffe, and he attacked the wealth of the church, preaching for equality between social classes. That got him arrested in 1366 as a heretic. People were forbidden to listen to his preaching, and Ball was excommunicated. After he was released from prison that time, he kept on preaching, just not inside the church. This time he would just preach outside, even if it was in the graveyard. And people kept on listening. Ball continued preaching against the Roman Catholic Church and its hierarchy by telling his congregations that they need not pay their tithes to unworthy priests, and stating that all property should be shared in common among the people.
Chris, I think it's funny he was preaching in graveyards. You remember that was forbidden because you're going to upset the dead people. You weren't allowed to be loud in graveyards during the day.
I think he liked to buck the system.
Sounds a little bit like it.
Sounds like my kind of guy.
Yeah. As you can imagine, those things, bucking the system, landed him in jail a second time in 1376. And at this point in history, the common people were overtaxed from the war with France. And it wasn't long till people found out about new taxes that were going to be levied against them. In 1381, there was an uprising of rebels known as the Peasants' Revolt. John Ball preached to them at one of their rendezvous points in an open-air sermon. So, Chris, what he said got him arrested. And this time, not just arrested, he got hanged, drawn, and quartered.
This is what he said. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? From the beginning, all men by nature were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. For if God would have had any bondman from the beginning, he would have appointed who should be bond and who should be free. And therefore, I exhort you to consider that now is the time to come. appointed to us by God, in which ye may, if ye will, cast off the yoke of bondage and recover liberty. That's quite a speech to make to people who are in the beginnings of a revolt.
Yeah.
Ball's head was displayed stuck on a pike on London Bridge, and the quarters of his body were displayed in 4 different towns because they wanted to make a point.
Sounds like it. Like
Yep.
we said in a couple episodes, they pretty much operated like the mafia.
The Inquisition was nasty.
They were really nasty. Wycliffe's teachings continued to spread. Others besides John Ball spread the message that the Bible alone was the sole authority for Christian doctrine and practice, and that priestly celibacy had no scriptural basis. They also preached that pilgrimages and prayer to images or relics distract from the true faith. The Lollards' teaching continued to spread throughout Europe in the 1370s and 80s, along with Wycliffe's criticisms of the Roman Church. The spread was helped by the fact that Wycliffe and his followers had support from nobles. There was John of Gaunt, who was also called the Duke of Lancaster, and the Knights of John of Gaunt's nephew, who's King Richard II's court. And these came to be known as Lollards' Knights.
In 1382, some English bishops, along with the Archbishop of Canterbury, started to fear the spread of what they considered this heresy from the Lollards. And from that, they feared more social unrest. Several assemblies of bishops declared Lollard teaching heretical, and it forced Wycliffe to retire from Oxford and move his parish to a church in Lutterworth, England, where he died 2 years later. With Wycliffe out of the way, persecution of the Lollards became even more severe, and those who were caught either had to recant or they were burned at the stake. It's estimated that by 1395, Lollard numbers reached into the tens of thousands, but by the 1420s, the movement survived only as a small underground sect, but it was never completely extinguished.
There were a lot of unwritten rules and complex situations when it came to royal succession. Some rulers came to the throne by lineage and some by familial connections, but others were by special appointments. But when you're studying the Middle Ages, there's one more thing to consider that affected the monarchs, and that was the tension that existed between the church and the state. Remember, we said they really had to think about going through the church, not getting on the wrong side of the papacy. There was always a battle for control between the papacy and the king. It might be underneath the surface at times, but it was always there.
Yeah, I mean, there was always a struggle of who was in charge of who. Was the Pope supreme authority over the emperor and king? Well, Rose, the Pope certainly claimed to be. In last week's episode, we talked about the Constantine donation. It was a document that the popes used to claim absolute power over everything spiritual and civil throughout the whole Holy Roman Empire. And they used that document to claim absolute rule and authority from 753 until 1440, when Lorenzo Valla proved it was a forgery.
The papacy functioned in a lot of ways like a political entity. They still do. Most nobles and everyone else in the land felt they owed allegiance to 2 rulers, the king of their country and God, their heavenly king, who the Pope was the representative of. Pope Innocent III actually used Jeremiah 1:10 to claim his authority as ruler over all. And Jeremiah 1:10 says, "See, I have set you this day over nations and over kingdoms to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant." Now, talk about ripping a verse out. It's obvious that this Pope Innocent III, as well as others, truly thought of themselves as God's representatives who were tasked with setting up kingdoms and bringing some down, almost as if they were gods themselves. Big difference than being God's representative as his child and thinking you're actually a god.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what they kind of functioned like.
And
Or
they
thought of
still
themselves.
kind of do.
Yeah. And the popes or someone of the ecclesiastical hierarchy were the ones that literally set the crowns on the king's heads at their coronation ceremonies. no matter who was pope at any given time, they had one advantage when it came to ruling over everything. They could excommunicate anyone that they pleased, whether king or clergy.
And as you can imagine, kings usually felt that they should at least have some power and control over their lands. But their only strength was military might, which didn't trump excommunication. So for centuries, there were many disputes between popes and emperors and kings and bishops, and especially when bishops became great landowners. This struggle for power was known as the investiture struggle.
That name comes from one early example of the church and state struggle that came between Pope Gregory VII, who claimed he was supreme representative of Jesus Christ on the earth, and Emperor Henry IV, King of Germany, in the 11th century. They butted heads over the important issue of appointments to church offices. Now, it might seem like a no-brainer that only the Pope would be the one to give ecclesiastical rule and authority over certain areas, since the bishops and abbots were spiritual leaders. But they functioned as much more than spiritual leaders. They also served as regional administrators, managing the church's vast land holdings and assisting in the governance of those lands. So having the support of these ecclesiastical rulers was something that would strengthen a king's authority.
Yeah, that's why Henry wanted to choose them for himself instead of letting the Pope do it. The struggle between Pope Gregory and Henry, who's both called emperor and king, became contentious. King Henry responded like he was on a TV show, The Apprentice, and said to Pope Gregory, "You're fired." But Gregory didn't flinch. And eventually, after more back and forth, Gregory said, "You're excommunicated." Now, Chris, the importance of being excommunicated could be lost on us today, but it wasn't then. Anyone excommunicated by the church was considered damned. When it came to a king, the Pope would tell all Christians throughout the realm that they no longer had to obey the king. And the Pope also gave them the right to withhold all taxes. And it was almost certain that the king would be deposed and replaced. Talk about power.
It was a big deal. In the case of this particular feud, this was such a big deal that King Henry IV saw the writing on the wall and crossed the Alps in the middle of winter with his wife and with his child to get to the Pope's residence so that he could humble himself and be reinstated to church membership. It was a really, really big deal. There are wood engravings commemorating the 3 whole days the family waited in the courtyard in the middle of winter outside of the Pope's house in order to beg his favor. On the 4th day, Pope Gregory relented, brought them inside, and repealed the excommunication only after Henry had agreed to be obedient to him. That happened in 1076. 4 years later, though, Henry used the only real power we said that kings had, military might, to take Rome and force Pope Gregory to flee. Now, we say all that for a reason, because we're going to talk about the English Reformation.
Chris, all I keep thinking of when you were saying that was in the movie The Godfather, when there was somebody, I can't remember his name, begging the Godfather for forgiveness. And he's like, "Kiss the ring, kiss the ring." Yeah.
I remember that scene.
Same thing.
Yeah.
But you're right. In the English Reformation, we're going to fast forward to 1491, and we're going to turn our sights back to England. On June 28th of that year, Henry Tudor, the son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, was born. Henry was one of 4 siblings to survive infancy. His older brother Arthur was the Prince of Wales. Henry was given a first-rate education. He was fluent in Latin and French, and even learned some Italian. As Henry grew up, he was given his own appointment and titles, but he was never expected to become king because his brother Arthur was the heir.
King Henry VII thought it would be wise to make an alliance with Spain. The best way to do that? A marriage. So in November 1501, at age 14, Arthur was married to Catherine, the youngest child of King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I of Spain. Catherine was 13 at the time, and that wasn't unusual back then.
No.
The next year, just 20 weeks after their wedding, Arthur unexpectedly died. His death made Henry the new Duke of Cornwall and the new Prince of Wales. It wasn't long until his father and Catherine's parents were talking of marriage between the widowed Catherine and young Henry so that they could keep up their alliance. And they signed a treaty to do that. And Henry VIII and Catherine were officially married on June 25th of 1503.
Both Catherine and her chaperone claimed that the marriage between her and Arthur had never been consummated. Cohabitation and consummation with Henry wasn't possible because he was too young. 4 years later, though, Henry was old enough to reject the marriage, and he did. Catherine, however, started to believe it was God's will for her and Henry to be married, even if he didn't want to be. And it must have been God's will for them to be married because after his father's death and his ascension to the throne in 1509, Henry suddenly declared his intentions to marry Catherine, saying that it had been his father's dying wish.
On June 11th, 1509, 17-year-old Henry and 23-year-old Catherine were wed, and their coronation ceremony as king and queen took place 12 days later. It wasn't long until she conceived, but the baby girl was stillborn. 4 months later, she became pregnant again, this time having a boy on January 1st, 1511. He died 7 weeks later. Over the next 4 years, she gave birth to 2 more stillborn sons, and then finally gave birth to a girl they named Mary, and that was in 1516. Mary was the only child of theirs to survive.
Most historians describe the marriage between Henry and Catherine as good, despite all the hardship of producing a male heir, something Henry desperately wanted. The couple had one last child, a girl, and she was also stillborn. After that, Henry started to become enamored with one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. Henry attempted to seduce her, but she refused to become just another one of his mistresses like her sister had.
Henry had at least 2 mistresses, and possibly many more, one of whom bore him a son in 1519, and that son's name was Henry Fitzroy. Henry had 3 options to produce a male heir to the throne. He could marry off he and Catherine's only child, Mary, hoping that she would produce a grandson who could ascend to the throne. But because of her young age, it was unlikely that she was going to bear a male child before Henry's death.
The second option was to legitimize Henry Fitzroy, which some believe Henry was attempting to do by making him Duke of Richmond. That was the first step in legitimization. But having an illegitimate heir to the throne would mean getting papal approval, and the throne would likely be open to challenge from more legitimate heirs, like cousins and other relatives. So the only option was to somehow legitimately end his marriage to Catherine, marry someone younger who could produce a male heir. So King Henry, now 34, decided to go in that direction to end his marriage to Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn.
This wasn't a light decision for him to make. Henry VIII was known for his devout Roman Catholicism. He attended Mass regularly, sometimes hearing 5 Masses a day in his private chapel. In 1521, he actually earned the title Defender of the Faith by Pope Leo X after writing a paper called Defense of the 7 Sacraments, and that was a work against the teachings of Martin Luther, in which Henry defended the idea of papal supremacy. He was for it.
But in England, like in the rest of Europe, people were tired of Roman bishops being rich landowners. They were tired of the priests and monks being really grossly immoral. England had its own leaders, like John Colet of Oxford, and he called for the reform of the Roman Church, and he started discussing Protestant ideas. In Cambridge, a group of scholars were so agreeable to Luther's teachings that they became known as Little Germany.
In 1527, once devout Catholic Henry convinced himself that the reason Catherine had not produced a male heir was because their union was cursed because he'd married his brother's widow. And using Leviticus 20, verse 21, which says, if a man marries his brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has dishonored his brother. They will be childless. Henry asked Pope Clement VII for an annulment of his 20-year marriage, and the Pope refused. Not only was Henry's reason for the annulment unbiblical and refuted based on Levirate law of marrying your deceased brother's wife and producing heirs, at the time that Henry asked for this annulment, Rome, and therefore the Pope, was being held hostage by Charles V of Spain, who had laid siege to the city. And Charles V of Spain was Catherine's nephew. So Pope didn't want
Yeah.
to go against him.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it was all intertwined politically. Not to mention that Leviticus passage says they'll be childless, and they weren't.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, the king did have some supporters in his quest for an annulment. One of those was Thomas Cranmer, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. He helped Henry build a case for annulment in his marriage to Catherine. Thomas Cranmer supported the idea of royal supremacy, not papal supremacy. Thomas Cranmer became a huge reformer. He was all in on the Reformation. Thomas Cranmer believed that the king should be considered sovereign over the realm, not the church. And his support helped bring about what happened next.
When the king was refused annulment of his marriage by the Roman Church, he went in a new direction, abandoning his previous claim that the Pope should be supreme ruler, and with the help of Thomas Cranmer and another supporter, Thomas Cromwell, an English statesman and lawyer who served King Henry VIII as his minister, they came up with new administrative procedures in the government. And Cromwell helped engineer an annulment of the king's marriage to Catherine by having Parliament endorse a claim by the king to be supreme head of the Church of England, giving him the authority to annul his own marriage. And that is how the Church of England was formed.
That's right. The Anglican Church it is now.
Mm-hmm.
So this break from the Roman Catholic Church was immediate. Henry quickly granted his own annulment from Catherine, married the already pregnant Anne Boleyn, and began the process of stripping the Roman Church of its wealth and land. And this was known as the dissolution of the monasteries. So between 1536 and 1540, with the help of Thomas Cromwell, over 800 monasteries were closed and their assets were taken by the crown. Again, this was all about money. It's estimated that this seizure increased Henry's income by about £150,000 a year. That's a massive sum for this time, Chris.
Yeah, and Henry's actions were met with some resistance. In 1536, a major uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace broke out in northern England. It was a protest against both the religious changes and economic problems. Henry brutally suppressed it. There were those who refused to swear an oath of supremacy, recognizing King Henry as head of the church, most famously Sir Thomas More, Henry's former Lord Chancellor. More was a staunch Catholic, and he refused to acknowledge Henry as head of the church, and it led to his execution for treason in 1535, one of the most notorious examples of Henry's increasing rule.
The break from Rome opened the door for more Protestant-minded reformers to push for change, something that accelerated under Henry's son, Edward VI, who came to the throne at age 9. Now, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was in charge of Edward's education. That's why Edward was such a staunch Protestant. So Edward VI comes to the throne at age 9, but he became terminally ill 6 years later. Edward tried to remove his half-sister Mary, the only surviving child of Henry and Catherine, who was the next in line to be heir, from the line of succession, because he didn't want her putting England back under Roman Catholicism. Remember, we said last week, we called her Bloody Mary. She's a staunch Catholic. So what he did was he redid his will and wrote in his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, to be the queen. Lady Jane Grey reigned for just 9 days in July of 1553 before being attacked by Mary's army, and she was eventually beheaded. You can hear more of her story in our episode number 199, Women of the Reformation. We did her in our series, Christians Every Christian Should Know.
Mary I took the throne in England and brutally persecuted Protestants as heretics in her attempt to, just what he thought she would do, make it Roman Catholic again. And you're right, Rose. She became known as Bloody Mary. She had over 280 religious dissenters burned at the stake, and that wasn't all.
And one of those was Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yep.
After the death of Mary in 1558, Henry's second daughter, Elizabeth I, reestablished the Church of England as a moderately Protestant body that retained many Catholic traditions. The Elizabethan settlement, as it became known, brought a level of stability after decades of religious whiplash. The English Reformation happened in a totally different way and for different reasons than the rest of the Reformation. But its challenge against the papal authority changed the direction of England forever.
It surely did. And that's a good place to end today. Today, we want to give a shout out to our listeners from Algeria, Bolivia, and Bulgaria. Have a blessed day, everybody.
And give him the glory, great things he has done.